At this time, I would like to turn today's program over to Matt Cagle. Mr. Cagle, you may begin.
Hi, thank you for joining the Implementing a Comprehensive Audit and Monitoring Program webinar. I'm Matt Cagle. I'm a Senior Director at Compliance Point. During my 7 years at Compliance Point, I've worked with dozens of schools to implement custom compliance and audit programs, and excited about what we are going to share with you today. I'm even more excited today to have Dr. David Harpool joining us. David is General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at North Central University, and he is an attorney at the law firm Dunn & Davison. David has over 22 years' experience in public and private school settings, having served as an officer and on the Board of Trustees of several colleges and educational institutions. He has counseled higher education institutions of all sizes and types on issues with the U.S. Department of Education, various higher education coordinating boards, and various accrediting agencies. He served as a peer evaluator and accreditation team member for multiple accrediting agencies. David previously served as Chief Operating Officer of Academics at Kaplan University. So today we want to talk to you about implement a comprehensive audit and monitoring program, and then we want to talk a little bit about how we implemented such a program at North Central University and open that up to David's perspective. As we go through, please jot down any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation. We will open it up to questions, so if you have one, please enter it into that pane, and again, we'll save a few minutes at the end to get to those. We want to start out talking a little bit about Compliance Point and North Central University. We want to let you know who we are and a little bit more about the backgrounds of our companies. We then talk about the specific steps that you would take if you are going to be implementing a comprehensive audit program at your institution. I'm going to turn it over to David. He's going to talk a little bit about the program that we implemented at NCU, and then we're going to provide you with some of the lessons that we learned throughout that process, and we'll by talking about how technology can be used to facilitate these ongoing monitoring and compliance efforts, a little bit of what we're doing at North Central as well. Compliance, we've been around for about 10 years. We offer a number of compliance and audit services, from direct marketing to expert witness services, now offering data and information security services. What this allowed us to do is, as we develop these comprehensive audit programs, we're able to bring the experts both from the marketing side and from the information and data security side. And with the experience we have in the education sector, we believe we're able to bring a unique perspective to the table, having worked with so many schools over the years. We've now worked with over 80 schools, and they combine to more than 700 campuses. So we're very proud of our track record in the education space, and again, believe that's a value add whenever we engage with a client. And as I mentioned, David is with North Central University. They are an excellent university based out of Scottsdale, Arizona. And David, I'd like to turn it over to you to give a little more background about your school.
We're a regionally accredited institution. We're an online university. The majority of our students are on a master's or doctoral level. Our faculty is dispersed across the United States and internationally. There are 100% doctoral faculty. And we have weekly course starts. So a couple of unique compliance challenges at our institution. One is we're dispersed. Two is that we start weekly. Three, that we're non-term based for our financial aid. And so compliance, monitoring and auditing has to be something that we can do through technology and in partnership with experts, because we don't have the luxury of walking down to a single campus and analyzing a single campus, which is why we really begun this partnership with Compliance Point.
David's point about the challenge of compliance, with our background in this space and with David's background in this space, we feel like we understand the challenges that you all face. We understand that if you're on this call today that you want to comply, you take compliance seriously. But I think we'd all agree that compliance is difficult. It can take a significant amount of resources, both from a time perspective, a human resources perspective, and from a financial perspective. It's just not easy. And what makes it more difficult is the requirements are constantly evolving. So just when you get one area buttoned up, it seems there's new legislation or a new regulation emerging, And you're constantly having to track those rules, determine how they impact your organization, and then the necessary steps to comply. And so the goal of this program is to make sure that nothing gets lost in the mix, because there are so many areas that we ultimately want to keep an eye on. I don't think I read this list for anyone today. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, but we do want to emphasize again the challenges that everyone's facing from the missions and financial aid side, now with career services and the scrutiny for placement rates or outcomes, and with the marketing piece. The Telephone Consumer Protection Act would be an area that you would think to much impact the education sector, but specifically when it comes to placing calls to prospective students, texting prospective students, reaching out to current and former students. That's something that is now a concern, and again, has just made compliance even more of a challenge for the students.
You know, one of the big challenges is not just the number of new regulations on higher education. There's numerous ones, but the consequences of not complying. Where there used to be a somewhat of a perspective of the government and regulatory bodies that will work with you to get into compliance, now the perspective has been if you're not in compliance, you're going to immediately move to a punishment or a sanction. So we not only have more to worry about, but the consequences are more significant. And so I think having an absolute audit plan for your compliance function, it can't just be left to luck. It has to be systematic and planned.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think when you look at the news and look at the headlines, it's clear that the level of enforcement seems to be higher than ever. Not only do we have the DOE, but now we've got the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Over the last 3 years, they've received over 1,000 complaints in regard to private student loans, and so that's brought their attention. You have the accreditors that are obviously feeling the pressure from the federal government. Class actions have become a real concern. Back to the TCPA, actions related to the TCPA, because of those amendments that came out last year, were up 69% last year, and this year they're tracking at 33%. And so whether it's the federal government, the state government, or the consumer themselves, there's definitely an eye on the industry and a need to make sure that you've got that compliance program in place.
Matt, if you look at the environment right now, you wouldn't take much of a look to find 4 or 5 examples of multi-million-dollar large educational institutions who have either paid significant fines, hundreds of millions of dollars, or they've been literally placed out of business because of compliance, often in one small unit of the mass operation. But compliance is kind of an all-or-nothing thing in this environment.
Absolutely. And it seems like days when there is an issue, however small it may be, that the press is just piling on, and so it's not even just the financial damage, but the public relations damage that sometimes results from any sort of non-compliance effort, and the impact that can have years afterwards once your school's name is in the news for non-compliance.
One of the things, I'm sorry, Matt, one of the things that we've noticed at Dunn & Davidson in the practice is that the number one first function of the accrediting bodies and the states is to place you on what's known as some type of notice, where you put on your website and in your printed materials that you've been placed on notice by your accrediting body or your state regulatory body that you may not be in compliance and therefore may not be in business. And to the point you just made, the public relations damage of trying to attract the right students to your institution when there's a big notice that says, however, this school may not be accredited or may not be in business in 2 years, is a really significant marketing issue. So the point just needs to be really underscored and made, and that is the public relations damage can be even more severe than straight out financial penalties.
Absolutely. So what it all leads to, I promise we're not trying to scare anybody, we're just trying to give everyone a real picture of what we're all facing, and I'm sure everyone agrees. But there is a need to implement a comprehensive audit program. Not saying you have to do this externally or internally. We believe both are an option. But I think we'd all agree that there are a number of areas that schools to comply with in one way or another. We need to have some sort of check and balance on the back end to make sure that compliance is being achieved as we all expect. What I want to do quickly is walk through how at Compliance Point we would suggest implementing a comprehensive audit program. Again, we think this is something that you can take internally and implement yourselves if you have the resources to support such a program. It's also something that could be conducted with an external team, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of each in just a little bit. The first step with the program is you've got to determine what your audit areas are going to be. It seems very obvious, but as we showed with that list earlier, and as you'll see as we talk more about our central program, there are just a number of areas that schools must comply with, and so you have to determine as part of this program and on an ongoing basis, what do you look at based on the resources that you have to allocate to this type of program, and also based on the requirements as you believe they would apply to your organization. You then, once you finalize those audit areas, want to make sure that you get this program to your faculty, to your staff, to your organization as a whole. Again, how critical it is to have their buy-in for this type of program. We've performed a number of compliance assessments and audits, and any time you have a third party on site, you hear the term audit or assessment or compliance, people get nervous, and understandably so. And so it's very important to make sure that your team members, all of your employees, understand that it's not a time that you are there trying to ensure that you're protecting your organization, and that this is for the benefit of the organization in the long run. And there's no expectation of non-compliance on their part. It's more of a checkup, and that really the auditor or assessor is working on the school's behalf. And if you can convey and get that buy-in, it's only going to result in a stronger audit with stronger results, because the auditor is going to get more employees. They're going to open up and give the information that we need as an auditor during the interviews and when we're requesting documentation.
For me, what was so important was, I wanted to make sure that the culture at North Central, and we give this advice at Dunn & Davidson, that compliance isn't a single person or department function. It is a comprehensive across the institution function. And it's not healthy when we look at compliance as solely somebody's job rather than all of our jobs. That's why it was so important to communicate to the faculty and the staff. The other issue that we found there was it was important for them to understand that this isn't a gotcha type of event. This is the belief that there's a point in every compliance issue where it's small enough to be seen, big enough to be seen, but still small enough to be solved. And that's when you want to catch compliance issues, not when out of control, not when getting whether there's one, but when they're big enough you can see them, but small enough you can control them. And that's exactly why we took this approach with Compliance Point, and it's the one Dunn & Davidson recommends to their clients.
Yeah. I can say that the worst results we get from an auditor and assessment is when the employee or the vendor is not aware as to who we are and why they're speaking to us. They're automatically nervous and guarded at the beginning of the interview process, and so that's the exact opposite of what we want in this type of program. To help streamline the audit, because this is such a broad audit, you want to prepare your documents ahead of time. We're going to go over a list of some documents that we would suggest if you're going to undertake but if you can gather those ahead of time and provide them to the auditor, it can help the auditor develop their questions while they're on site, and it can also limit the amount of time it's going to take for your team to complete the audit. If they have to gather documents one-off at the end of the program, that's going to extend it out. Everything we can get ahead of time and provide the auditor is just going to help further refine the audit and help and guide the auditor as they probe the questions during the interviews. When everything is aligned there, you're going to want to coordinate for the on-site component. So again, whether internal or external, the auditor does need to meet with people face-to-face. We've had clients ask for assessments and audits before. They are definitely a challenge, and they definitely do not get to the same level as they can with a face-to-face audit program, and so that's something that we strongly suggest. For this type of program, likely the auditor is going to need to visit multiple locations if that would apply to your school. This could be a sampling of campuses, your corporate location, your headquarters, and if you you have any vendors, we would recommend a call or a series of calls with the vendors to get a better picture of their efforts on your school's behalf, and that would be supplemented with a documentation request from those vendors to make sure that we can back up everything they would say during the call. Audit, you've got to make sure that you get to work. The audit is really just the beginning of this whole program, and so once you have the results, it is critical to implement those recommendations to close any gaps that are identified. It's worse to have the audit completed and have all of this in writing and then not to take any steps afterwards than it is to not do anything at all. Having documented non-compliance that's not followed up by any remediation efforts looks bad, and so as you begin this program, it's important to make sure that you're ready at the end of it to tackle those gaps that are identified and put the necessary resources towards getting those closed and remediated. And then once that is done, that's where the ongoing monitoring and enforcement is critical. All these steps are great, but if you're not keeping an eye on compliance over time, things are going to start to open up, and a lot of this could be for naught in the long run.
So one of the things that was really important to us in working with you is when we got our final audit, and it listed, of course, the things we were in compliance with, which was the vast majority and the 90 percentile, I think. Then there were some things that we were in compliance, but they weren't in compliance because of systems. They were in compliance because of particular people. So we've identified what are the policies and procedures that need to be put into place so that those don't become accidental, they become systematic. And then the last group of things we need to work on, and we prioritize those. We've created a working group, and we have a project management assigned to it so that we can directly address those concerns. And I think that's the real value of the compliance audit. As you said, it's not just finding out where gaps are. It's having something to work from that gives you a chance to address those gaps, which is not only persuasive in courts and with regulatory bodies, but a good way to be preventative and avoid risk.
Yeah, and to your point, that's exactly what we're looking for and would suggest any or look for again for any company, school that's considering doing this themselves. And we don't want to dissuade anyone from doing that. We would suggest any sort of audit or assessment is better than nothing. And so the model that we follow whenever we're working with a client and that we suggest our clients follow when they're developing their own program is what you see here. It's in the policies and procedures, but it really can be worthless at the end of the day if we don't have that monitoring and ultimately the enforcement that we need at the end. One that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle that we always want to look for is legal awareness. This seems obvious, but it is rare that we actually find a client that has the necessary legal support in place to make sure they remain up to date on all applicable rules. There's usually one go-to firm or person that's feeding them with updates that are specific to one area of their business, whether it's joining newsletters from law firms or industry associations or getting a firm on retainer to provide you with those updates. We think it is absolutely critical that you have some source of legal awareness that can tip you off when changes are coming so you have the time to adjust. Back to TCPA, this is an area where when those amendments went into effect in October 2013, the amount of people we were talking to that were not prepared to comply, they didn't make the necessary adjustments to their technology or to their marketing operations. It was very surprising. So a lot of people actually had to stop marketing at that point until they could make the necessary adjustments, even though they had 12 months notice from the TC or from the FCC that this was coming. They were not aware in time and didn't make the necessary adjustments, and so they actually felt an impact on their bottom line because of the prize once they became aware of it. And so that's something that everybody, no matter how large or small your company is, you want to make sure you've got someone keeping you updated on those requirements that are going to impact your company. That's where we're going to, as the auditor, make sure that you've got those policies and procedures. So it's great to say, yeah, we do this, we're aware of this, and we comply. It's going to be pretty meaningless to a regulator if you can't show in black and white how you do that. First, you've got to have that applicable policy or procedure that outlines how school adheres to that requirement. that's to be supplemented by training. So the policy is good, but then we got to make sure people are aware of it and are adhering to it. That's where you have documented training materials and training records. We often see schools and companies that have training. It's face-to-face. There might be a sign-in sheet or something simple, but it's going to be very hard for them if they ever have to go back and show who did the training, exactly what they saw, and exactly what they were supposed to do. So the more record keeping you can do as you go through this process, the better.
One of the things that we've noticed with training, and we had it internally and our other clients have had it as well, is they'll have training, but as you know, it's not systematic, it's not documented. So, for example, they might bring a new employee on who's dealing with the ADA or the IDEA, and the particular employee has some degree of informal introduction to the two areas. But then if that employee changes or another employee's handling the circumstances or gets faculty or administrators involved, they've had no training in it. So whether it's a human resource issue like FMLA or whether it's a student accommodation issue under the ADA, the training needs to be systematic and it needs to be documented, and it used to be more widespread than the typical client of ours does it. And it's an interesting thing. It's very difficult for an educational institution to make the argument that they think training was important. We're an education business, and yet I see that paradox argued all the time. So I just want to re-emphasize the fact that probably among our compliance issues, the vast majority of our issues was not systematic training. We trained, but it wasn't systematic, so as soon as an employee left, then we had to hope someone caught the fact that there's a new employee in this position.
Yeah. At that point, another thing that we often see related to training is lack of refresher training. So most schools have the new training program that everyone goes through, but a year there's not that refresher training that you would like to see that would provide an update on whatever the new policies and procedures are for the school, or just a refresher on exactly what needs to be done to ensure compliance on an ongoing basis. We've already talked a little bit about how monitoring and enforcement are important at the back end of everything, but this is something you will see in almost every enforcement action. You have compliance policy in place, but what we often fail to see is schools taking necessary steps to make sure that everything's occurring as required. Not necessarily a comprehensive audit on an annual basis, but some form of monitoring to make sure that people are saying what they're supposed to say during their interactions with prospective and current students and processing the necessary forms, etc. Whatever it may be, we often all get very busy and are trying to obviously maximize output in our respective roles, but it's also important to make sure that we do have some sort of oversight and ongoing monitoring, and not just taking it for granted that we're in compliance. And then, don't spend too much time on this point, but if you do identify issues of non-compliance, there does need to be some sort of enforcement or remediation. And so after you go through the audit and you implement a program, if you identify anything, you've got to make sure that you show regulators that you are serious about non-compliance, and whether it's retraining of that employee or that department, sort of notice or verbal warning, that's critical and necessary. Termination, obviously, it's not something that we encourage, but if the compliance error or issue justifies it, then that's something that might need to be done. But ultimately, you've got to know that your school as a whole does not take compliance for granted and does not just brush away those issues as they pop up.
And points there, Matt. One is it's very difficult to take disciplinary action against an employee because they've been trained appropriately on what the employee's job responsibilities and standards are. The second one is I think it's really important when you talk about remediation. I think folks participating could be overwhelmed by, holy cow, though, there's so much for us to get to. So what we found was prioritizing was a really important step after we got the audit. We prioritized by the fact of what provided the greatest exposure to us, and we worked our way down. Not that the bottom one isn't still an issue for compliance that we want to address quickly, but we found if we prioritized, it gave a working plan that didn't seem so overwhelming. And we're a large institution of almost 10,000 students, and we have basically 2 employees in the area of compliance and regulatory affairs. And we have found it's very manageable if used a decentralized across the institution functional committee rather than having a single department handle all this, and finding that we're able to address these issues much faster.
So for anyone that's considering this, we've touched on a few of these challenges, but I do want to reemphasize a few of these. The first thing is you got to develop that trust with your team, make sure they're all aware that it's to their benefit to participate in the program, and that's only going to help in the long run. Scope is something that definitely needs to be considered. You have to look at all the areas that will be included in such a program, and then look at auditing those through all internal departments, your campuses. You also have to speak to faculty members, and then if you're utilizing any vendors to support some of the functions, they'll need to be a component of the audit as well. So it does take a decent amount of time to make sure that you perform efficient audit by meeting with all those parties and reviewing all of the documentation. I mentioned it, if you do identify areas, a challenge times can be taking action on those. And so before you even begin this process, you've got to make sure you're ready to do so and that you're ready to allocate the necessary resources and steps to close gaps. A few things that we would suggest you consider with such a program. First, do you use an internal or external auditor? We use a blended approach. We think you absolutely have some sort of internal monitoring audit program. Whether you use an internal team that performs such a comprehensive audit would be to, if you could afford an external auditor, or if you want to dedicate the time to working with an external auditor. You believe your internal team doesn't have the necessary level of expertise, and so with that approach, you can supplement your internal resources and efforts by using a third party that's going to have the expertise that you identify any gaps, but also it's going to help avoid any notions of bias. And using an independent third party and getting that report, if you show that to a regulator, if they see the level of scrutiny that you're going to, it's only your case in the long run if you then are able to show that you did the audit because you wanted to work and again close any of those gaps that were identified. The next thing to consider is how you're going to get the results. We've delivered a number of ways to the companies that we've worked with. Oftentimes it'll just go to the compliance department. This is companies that are ready to get on closing those gaps the second they get the report. All counsel. There are some companies that are comfortable getting the report through general counsel. They believe it'll provide the necessary level of privilege. And then outside counsel, which is obviously going to provide with this layer of privilege, but obviously that does include an additional cost. Any thoughts as to those options?
I think a couple of things. I think the reason you want the outside auditor, to the first point, is even if your intent is in the long term to handle these internally, I think you want someone who's an expert to basically teach how to do it, at least the first one. We found that we wanted a continuing relationship because we wanted an external validation. So I think that you would want to get somebody from the outside, at least initially. Secondly, in terms of how to handle the results, I'm a big fan of having it go through your general counsel's office, or general counsel thinks it's important, outside counsel. The reason for that is, A, you want to protect privilege as much as you can and confidentiality of the report. Next, it's often more intuitive for the general counsel to understand which of these things are a higher priority versus others in terms of risk. And I think finally, it gives general counsel or your outside counsel a chance to summarize the results so that the actual raw audit report is widely disseminated, that we might get outside of the institution, and yet it's still a working document internally. So I would recommend those results. However, there was nothing in our compliance audit that would have concerned me had it gone directly just to the compliance department, one of the employees who reports to me. But in this case, I recommend, at least from the Dun & Davidson hat, that you go through your general counsel, outside counsel, just to at least give the argument of protection in case this were to ever attempt to be discovered outside a plaintiff's firm.
Yeah, the last consideration is the frequency of audits. Obviously, we don't want to part the cart of the horse, but if you begin a program such as this, one thing to consider is, do you plan on doing this on an annual basis or on a regular basis down the road? That will auditor, as they develop the report, provide that to you. If it's going to be something that you want them to update over time, they can craft all of that in a way to where it's be more efficient for both parties in the long run. And then also, I do want to point out that the requirements are always changing. And so if you want one of these, it's not a set it and forget it type of deal. You want to consider something such as this at least periodically, again, where it's done internally or externally. But as the one's aware, just when we've all buttoned up, there's new requirements emerging, and you want to make sure that you stay on top of those.
And just you do your financial audit, just like you do usually some type of accreditation report on an annual basis. It just makes sense to us to have this as an annual event. Doesn't mean that we don't monitor changes more frequently. I mean, one of the things that most of the law firms in this space do is they keep a pretty constant analytical view of what are the laws and how are they changing, and they basically do client notifications. For example, if you're involved in online learning or if you're involved in multi-state distribution of learning, you'll know that the 50 state regulations have changed multiple times over the last 3 years. And then they're on and then they're off based on what particular court ruling. So we recommend you have that function provided by a law firm. We also recommend that you use a partner to an annual audit that gives you an external validation on an annual basis.
It seems like a lot of work. It definitely is, and while it's going to take some time and money, there are some benefits to this. We're going to be talking about it today. I think the most important one is it's going to help give you peace of mind and avoid any surprises. Oftentimes, companies think they've got everything and not at any risk, and you'd be surprised at what we discover and what the senior management or executive team is unaware of. It's all going to just make sure that everything you've put in place, from policies and procedures to that training, is occurring as you believe it should. We're often told that you train on that and everyone's aware of what to do in that situation, but then we'll get down to the campus level and the looks on the faces of the people that we're interviewing let us know that they're completely aware of whatever respective policy or training the executive was talking about. And so this is going to make sure that's occurring as it should. And what we think is important is the defendable position. Anytime you can show a regulator that you're taking steps to comply, it's only going to help you. And so in such a report, if you can show the steps that were taken afterwards, it's going to help you if you do ever have an issue that you have to defend. And it's pretty obvious, but we've got the stats to back it up from our time doing this. When employees know that they're going to be reviewed or audited, their behavior, their performance improves. We've got case after case where the frequency and of compliance issues decreases with ongoing monitoring or auditing. We're talking from some percent down to less than 1% by the time the program's in place. And so you can see dramatic improvement with something like this over time.
And dealing with the Department of Ed or a state regulatory body or a creditor or in a court, and you're dealing perhaps with a jury, the question that almost always gets asked more than the technical violation is, what's the culture of compliance for a particular institution or business? And what I have found in our practice and as a general counsel is that it's not enough for CEO or COO or president or provost to send memos out saying, you know, we need to be in compliance and we take compliance serious and everybody has a code of conduct. What they want to know is, what did the senior leadership do to validate the fact that the employees were in fact being compliant in their day-to-day activities, so that there's not a chance that there's two messages being sent, which is, yes, we want you to be compliant, but not if it interferes with profitability. And because that perception exists among some regulatory environment, it's important that the CEO and the executive leadership can say, not only do we tell our folks that compliance is important. And we train them on what compliance means, but we audit them on an annual basis, and we do so with an independent person, just like we do our financial audits. And I think that is perhaps the best single defense against arguments that the culture was not a culture of compliance, which is when you often get into the multi-million-dollar judgments or the really harsh regulatory sanctions.
I'm going to talk a little bit about how we specifically implemented such a program at North Central. As you'll see, we followed the steps that we just showed you. We took time to meet with David and team to discuss the areas that we wanted to include in the audit. As Dave mentioned, they thought they were in compliance, but there was a method to validate through a third party, a non-biased third party. We met multiple times as we scoped the audit, again looking at everything that we believe NCU has to comply with, and also getting David's feedback and his team's feedback on everything that they want us to evaluate. While that was in place, we set up a time to go on site and took multiple visits, meeting, as I mentioned, with nearly all departments and speaking with nearly all vendors. And through all this, we're utilizing our compliance portal to support the auditing and the findings, and that's going to be used over time to facilitate ongoing compliance. And we'll show a little
and
bit.
a couple of points there. One of the reasons why we were attracted to Compliance Point is I was frustrated as general counsel that I was going to have one company help me with an admissions audit, one company with a financial aid audit, one company with an HR review, and I wanted one comprehensive audit. I wanted it to be done in a series of steps. I wanted it to be done in relatively close proximity. I wanted it all in one report, and so we were looking for a company who had that skill set that was comprehensive enough that they're kind of your one call, and we found that when we found Compliance Point. The issue is it was really important, and this is something Compliance Point brought to the table that I thought was so important. They basically insisted that each of our functional leaders in our institution sign off on the standards to be evaluated. That way, there wasn't any conversation at the end that, but that's not what I should really be measured against, or that's not really the standard, or that's not really important, or no one in our industry follows that. It stopped those arguments by the fact that all of my functional leaders had signed off on the criteria prior to Compliance Point coming in and evaluating that criteria. And then on that last issue, it was especially important to us that we get some type of portal function called a compliance dashboard. They can monitor, and our chief executive officer can monitor from our desktop, so we see where we stand with compliance when it comes to things like regulatory filings, authorizations, how many call violations do we believe we might have had in a month from admissions or advising. Those are the things we're looking for so that we have a snapshot on a daily basis.
And as you mentioned, there were a number of areas that we had your team sign off on. We really tried to make this as comprehensive as possible. So, from Americans with Disabilities Act down to satisfactory academic process, and then looking at various HR policies. So it was comprehensive, but again, we got the buy-in that we needed to get this done. And we looked at North Central's accreditation standards under the Higher Learning Commission, and then one area that often gets, I think, under the rug or really overlooked by companies is the information security and data security piece. That's something that we're able to bring to the table, and based on the exposure that some companies are having now, both in the education sector and outside of it, and his team thought it was critical that we evaluate all their websites and student portals to make sure that their student information was not at any risk of being exposed. And programs, while it might seem complicated to put something like this into the place, the technology is there for our auditors on the information security team to quick check this. They can do this in about a day. Some of the technology they have that they can plug into servers and into your databases and into your websites to test if there's any vulnerabilities. And then we wrapped it up with marketing compliance. Again, this is an area that sometimes schools don't believe applies to them based on only calling people that have requested information or only texting people that have requested information. But the rules do apply with something that we included to make sure that NCU's marketing efforts adhering to everything that applies.
And Matt, the federal government has told us very clearly for the industry that admissions, financial aid, and marketing and the honesty and integrity in those areas are absolutely essential for the institution to maintain its Title IV eligibility.
Yep. And we supported all of the document review. So, as we said, this is comprehensive. We requested a number of documents. If you don't have those as a school, please don't feel like you quickly need to develop one just to pass an audit or to get a compliance score on an audit. It's better for the auditor to know your true picture of compliance, and so they want to see the policies and procedures that are in place but are actually being used. And something that you create just to pass an audit is not really going to be a valid picture of your compliance posture. But if you are considering taking one of these, this is a list of documents that we would suggest that you would pull together and have your team of auditors begin reviewing. So I'd like to open it up to David to talk a little bit about what your takeaways were from the audit and some of the lessons you learned.
Sure. What first learned is that we were in substantial compliance in almost all areas across all functions, which is what we were hoping we would find. But what we did find are some areas that, like I said earlier, were not systematic. We weren't in compliance because we had policies. We were in compliance because we had good people. But the problem is, as you know, people move from company to company. It was personnel dependent. The second thing we found was that there were some areas where we were absolutely in compliance, but we were not in best practices. One of our goals was not just to get in compliance, but to find out what are the people who are doing this the best are doing. And so it was one of our target lists. It confirmed to us that our internal compliance function ought to be cross-functional and not silo approach. It's been my experience both practicing at Dunn & Davidson and at North Central that the silo approach creates a catch-up mentality when in fact you want employees to identify areas of compliance because we find out about them faster when the entry-level or the student-facing employee is able to identify them for you. We found a way to share this report, a summary of it, with our board, which gives our board the ability to comply with their legal responsibility, which they have oversight in terms of the ethics and the compliance of the university. It provided the president and I with a dashboard view of compliance where we know basically where we are in each given area of functionality and how we would score each area independently with our own review. Then it continued to reinforce the fact that we use Dunn & Davidson, but other firms, make sure that we're constantly getting a systematic review of the applicable laws, regulations. As you know, one of the decisions the Department of Education made would allow all 50 states to set basically their own standards for determining physical presence, whether or not you have an obligatory obligation towards that state. And that's no little feat to keep control of that, plus all the other changes that are going on with gainful employment and all the other new regulations. So those are the primary lessons learned, and they were very valuable lessons. And there's no question as we look back that if you look at costs and time spent, this was one of the better investments that North Central University has made.
And a few thoughts from the auditor side. Again, whether internal or external, I think the tips are only going to help if you're implementing such a program. So regardless of the type of audit that we're performing, as it sounds obvious, but you've got to have a point person to help coordinate everything, especially the gathering of documentation. It's sometimes difficult for an outside party to email your director of financial aid and ask for a BC policy. That wasn't the case at North Central because everyone they knew they had to participate, but at other schools and companies we've worked with, sometimes they don't know who and why we're reaching out to them, and so we've got to have someone that can track that information down for us and almost more importantly, help schedule the interviews and the follow-up communications that might occur. We understand everyone's very busy and has their day-to-day jobs to perform, but for such a program, we really need the participation of everyone, and having a point person internally really facilitate that. Regarding the audit, you also want to consider, once you get the results, who's going to handle working to close the gaps and implement recommendations. Again, once this is documented, you want to get to work, and so that's something to start considering ahead of time. So once you receive that, you're ready to get to work, and you got an identified set of employees or department that's going to be able to take those steps for you. And then, not specific to North Central, but just all the assessments and audits we've performed, one thing that I constantly see is there's very rarely someone that's intentionally non-compliant. The employees that we interview almost always want to adhere to the requirements. They serve their company and protect the company. It's often they don't know what they're required to do under the company's policies and procedures, and that could be because of that lack of refresher training or new hire training, or they promoted or moved departments and didn't get the training as they should have. And so, whether in a program or not, that's something to consider. Is you're getting up to snuff, you have that monitoring in place to make sure that everything's occurring the way it should once that training has been performed. So with the last few minutes, I quickly want to talk about technology as you implement such a program. It's going to only make the program more efficient. It's only going to facilitate your gathering of documents and your development of reports. The report that we'll show you in a second, as David mentioned, can be very helpful to make sure that everything's in compliance on an ongoing basis. It serves as a dashboard so you can put your different compliance programs in there. But there are a number of options that are available to companies out there, whether you use a vendor, SaaS model, or whether you develop your own tool. If you can leverage the technology, though, to have all the training materials, all the records, all the events that have to occur, that's going to really help facilitate your compliance program and be something that you show regulators or your creditors or anyone if need be. I think one important thing is that if you take the time, and it's going to take some time initially to implement the tool, is it's going to help with ongoing auditing. And so this is one of our thoughts with North Central was, let's take time to get the portal in place, to get everything in the portal. Year one, that's going to take much more time, but year two, year three, year four, it's going to make the audits much more smooth, and it's also going to allow North Central's team to be there on a day-to-day basis, updating things as they occur. So when the auditor's on site next time, much more of a validation of, oh, is this occurring? Is it good? Is having to track down how is it occurring? We've also identified an opportunity where this technology can be used across multiple compliance programs. And so if you have reports for your credit agency or for the DOE or for your state, the portal can be leveraged to help develop those reports by mapping controls from one set of criteria to another. And so I want to show a little bit what we're talking about. So this was that we're implementing North Central University. It shows your compliance on a day-to-day basis. It also has the ability to create alerts. And so if there ever is anything that is not updated in the tool as it should be to verify that the event has occurred, an alert's going to go off, and a designated employee or department has to take some sort of action to close the alert, and then it gives the managers and the executives the ability to go in and verify that was closed, took place as it should. You can see here that it gives the day-to-day status of the compliance posture. And so this is going to act as an alert for David and his team if there's ever anything, again, that did not occur as required. So it could be as simple as the January refresher training on misrepresentation. The annual ADA training wasn't logged in the portal as it should be. They're going to make sure that that occurred. And this is where we really want to take the time to flesh out those standards with your auditor and get that into the portal so it can help facilitate your program on an ongoing basis. So that concludes everything we have for today. David and I will remain on to take questions again. If you want to ask us any questions, please do so in the chat pane, and we'll get to as many as we can. If we cannot get to all of them, we'll sure that we follow up via email or phone following the webinar. Again, thanks for your time today. If you do have questions, my contact information is here. If you have questions specifically for David, please reach out to me, and I'll make sure it gets passed along to him, and we'll make sure we get back to you. So again, thanks everyone for taking the time, and now open it up to questions.
If you would like to ask a question, please navigate to the right-hand side of your screen and select the Q&A box. Type in your question and press send to submit.
Our first question is in regard to the slides, asking if we'll be sending out a copy to all attendees. We are happy to send out a PDF of the slides if you're interested. I will send them out to the individual that asked this question. If anyone else would like a copy of the slides, please let us know, and we'd be happy to send those to anyone that was able to join today. The question we have in regard to the length of this type of audit, just how long does this type of audit take? So as the preparation goes, it will take it'll be about a month of conversations to scope the entire audit, and then once that's finalized, North Central, we write multiple times probably for a total of about 10 business days. That I assume would be reflective of most schools, but for a very large school, it would likely take more time because we'd have to do more random campus visits as well. There's the follow-up component of gathering the necessary documentation and any follow-up items that we might need. It can typically take another few weeks after the on-site component as the auditors try to finalize the report for your team. So I believe that's all the questions we've got now. If I don't have any more, thanks everyone for taking time to join today. Thanks again, David, for joining us. And again, if you want a copy of the slides, please let us know, and we'll be happy to send you some.
Thank you again for joining us today. This concludes this web conference, and you may now disconnect.